So, hello everybody. My name is Martin Loffers. I'm the Chief Trend Watcher of Supply Chain Media. Welcome to Webinar Wednesday. So we have a great webinar coming up in the next hour about supply chain risk and resilience. I have two experts on this matter. And next to that, we have, after 5 o'clock, we have 30 minutes of interactive talks. So we can sit down in a lounge and talk to each other. You can talk to us, to the experts, but even you can go sit down at tables and have a discussion with the other participants of this webinar. We have more than 200 registered, so I hope that a lot of it will show up. So probably people will still join in right now. So welcome to this webinar. Like I said, my name is Martin Loffers. I will be the moderator of this webinar. And with me, and now, yes. So I'm on the left. You see my picture. So I'm chief editor of Supply Chain Movement, the quarterly magazine, and also editor-in-chief of the Dutch Supply Chain magazine. And with me, I have Professor Dr. Michael Hutt. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Martin.
Could you explain a bit about yourself, who you are?
Yes, of course. I'm a professor of business, especially logistics and supply chain management at Fulda University, which is a small place, approximately an hour in the east of Frankfurt.
And you will presenting a survey what you did together with the BME, the Supply Chain and Procurement Association of Germany.
Exactly, yes.
Okay, so welcome. Welcome, Harold.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Could you explain a bit about yourself, who you are and what you represent?
Absolutely. So my name is Harold Nitschinger. I'm co-founder and managing director of Prewave. And Prewave is a startup that works with large manufacturing companies to help them safeguard their supply chain from risks like COVID pandemic, but also others like labor strikes, natural disasters, and such as.
Okay, so welcome to you both, and welcome to the audience. This will be recorded, and we will make the recording available in the next 48 hours. And also the presentation will be made available later as a PDF, so in the next 2 days. Everybody's on mute, but feel free to ask questions during the presentation, during the webinar, during the next hour. So you will see on the right-hand side a question mark, a cloud with a question mark. In that area, you can ask your questions. And please use that functionality, because even when there are questions, you can like other questions. So 2 weeks ago, we had questions about blockchain, and we were suddenly bombarded with 20 questions all of a sudden, and you have to select, and you can vote for questions, and then I'll know as a moderator which one to ask first. So that you can do that on the right-hand side at the question mark. But feel free to not wait for the Q&A at the end, but feel free to ask your questions right away. And if they are in line with the discussion and presentation we have, I will ask these questions right away. And afterwards, after the hour, we have 30 minutes, like I said, in the lounge to discuss further. All right. Next, I would like to say now, so Michael, you have done a study, so go ahead, do your presentation, and let's start.
All right, Martin, thanks very much for the introduction, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this webinar and to this presentation. Thanks for your interest. I see a lot of people attending here from probably all over the world. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present some results we derived from Germany and Austria. Maybe it's interesting if your views from around the world are different. Maybe you have different ideas about the status of supply chain risk management in your country, for example. So let's discuss this later in this webinar or in the lounge. So let's start with the topic in 2020 and 2021. And well, I do not have to say more about this picture. This is self-explanation, I guess. But what we can see is that the corona pandemic has major effects on all areas. And we see that, for example, in 2020, there's a decrease of worldwide merchandise trade volume by 9.2%. And you see that from 2011 on, you have a steady rise in the merchandise trade volume. This is very consistent over a long time, and now we have this sharp drop And if you look at the different scenarios that are created by the World Trade Organization, even the optimistic scenario is far behind what had been expected in the beginning of 2021 before the pandemic. So it's major effects for almost all industries. There are some industries that are, well, that gain business, of course, but in general, it's a tough time for most of the businesses.
If you look at this chart, it's not like the economist said or expected a V-shaped dip. It doesn't represent any kind of ladder as I see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So can you explain more about the corona pandemic? What has the effects of it?
Well, I guess we can discuss that later, and maybe it's also something that Harald is addressing when he comes to predicting scenarios like a pandemic. Here, well, one thing that is often brought into the discussion is that the corona pandemic is a black swan, and you might have heard this term actually from the financial industry. Here, I would say the corona pandemic is definitely not a black swan, and I would like to refer to Donald Rumsfeld, the previous Ministry of Defense in the US. He actually classified, let's say, what we know, and he had two. And you see that matrix in the middle of that page. He had two ideas. He thought about the meta-knowledge. Do we know about something? And then the specific knowledge. And again, we can decide between known and unknown knowledge. Mm-hmm. And a black swan is something where you see that on the left-hand side, where Donald Rumsfeld says there are the so-called unknown unknowns. We do not know. We don't know. It is really difficult. If you think about this, it is something that is totally unexpected. However, the pandemic is not unexpected. If you look back to some risk analysis, and I have, you cannot see that, you cannot read that, but in the middle of that white block is a screenshot from a risk analysis that had been done by the federal government in Germany, or ordered by the federal government in Germany, in 2012, and actually it was a risk analysis about a mutated coronavirus coming from, actually, and the assumption was it comes from the Far East, and it appears in April, which was a little bit later predicted. Actually, remember, it was carried out in 2012, so more than 8 years ago, and it was published on the 3rd January in 2013. And if you read that article, or if you read that risk analysis, you have, I would say, an 80% match of what is happening at the moment. Mm-hmm. So actually, things were known. Of course, it was clear there will sooner or later be a pandemic. Not everything about the specifics of the pandemic were known, but some aspects were definitely known, and that's why it's not a black swan.
And how does it relate to the topic of supply chain risk management?
Well, actually, we see now that that the effects are really crucial. So it makes sense to have the supply chain risk management. And we have seen in the beginning of the pandemic that some of the supply chains really had problems. Not only toilet paper and yeast and flour, but also medical devices, for example, and all other supply chains, especially when they were globally distributed, had problems, especially when it came to border crossing and so on. So even though we can say supply chain risk management is crucial now, before and during a pandemic, it's also, and even the same, crucial to have it in non-pandemic times. And this is something that brings me to the objectives of the short presentation. I would like to give you some ideas on the status quo of supply chain risk management based on a survey we did with the Association of Purchasing and Supply Chain Management in Germany last year. We published this in November, and I would like to address the question in general: what's the status quo? How is it implemented in an organization, for example? How regular is it carried out? What tiers in the supply chain are actually covered and analyzed in that supply chain risk management. And also, and that leads to the answer, or to the question, how mature is it? How professionally is it carried out? And of course, and then we have the link to the beginning pages. How has so far supply chain risk management dealt with the effects of the corona pandemic? So, if we look at this, well, even though Martin has introduced me, that we have some people behind the survey. That's Carsten Knauer from the BME, that's the Association of Purchasing and Procurement and Supply Chain Management, and myself. And I do not want to go into details here, but I would like to address the details of the survey. We had an online survey conducted in just a few months after the beginning of the corona pandemic. There was 6 weeks in May and June 2020. We had more than 200 participants in total and more than 100 fully answered questionnaires. That means some people answered, let's say, 50%, 70%, and then stopped. So that's why it's not 214 fully answered questionnaires. Mm-hmm. What we have also done is we have had 10 expert interviews with people from the survey from different industries. So all this together, we have a participant structure that represents the industries quite well. So on one hand, regarding the company size measured in revenue, we have the large companies. We also have medium-sized companies and small companies. And we have addressed this survey to different functions. We have addressed it to the supply chain, purchasing, logistics function. We also have addressed it to general management, and we have addressed it to people from risk management. Most of the people, or most of the participants of the survey, you can see that here in blue. Sorry, it's difficult to read on screen, I guess. Only if you have a very large screen, you can read it. But you will get the slides later. The blue area is the people coming from supply chain management, purchasing, logistics. And that is good on one hand, but it also means there are only 20-some% coming from risk management, and that might have some influence on the answers of the study, because with the domination of the logistics and supply chain people, maybe the risk management aspects are a little bit, well, let's say underrated or underestimated.
To the audience, yeah, you can enlarge your screen, the slide. So on the upper left corner. Upper right corner, sorry, you can see a small button with small arrows, and you can enlarge the presentation, so you can enlarge the slides.
Yeah. Okay. We have 11 different industries, so there's no specific industry focus onto automotive or logistics. So it's very broad. Well, the first question, and one of the important question is that gives an implication on how important is supply chain risk management, was the question if an independent function for supply chain risk management exists in a company. An independent function does not necessarily mean it's a department, but it should be somebody who is actually responsible for supply chain risk management. And what you can see here, that's a little bit, let's say, frustrating if you come from that area, is that only every fifth company has somebody or has an independent function for risk management for supply chain. So if you look at companies, most of the companies do not have this function implemented. So that means that people, let's say from purchasing, say they also do some risk management. People from supply chain management, they do some risk management, but not something where some people are really dedicated to risk management in supply chains. And
so how do you expect to organize it? Should you address a supply chain director or a purchasing director to have this responsibility as part of his or her job?
I would say not necessarily the director of supply chain management or purchasing, but I guess there should be what you see so far, and that came out in the interviews, is that let's say the risk identification and the risk analysis is done by many people in the supply chain, but independently, and some do it more intensively, others not so far, so not so intensively. And I would say if there's at least one person who is responsible for it to cover it, like a supply chain manager who should be responsible for the supply chain, there should be some one person, well, not the director, who is responsible for identification, analysis, evaluation, and so on of risk in the whole supply chain.
Yeah. Okay.
And this is also something that we could see in the interviews and also in the text messages we received. Here we have some answer on the right-hand side. You can see that it's not anchored in the company. Yeah, of course, individuals are doing it, but it's not implemented as a whole independent function.
So what are the barriers for supply chain risk management?
There are a lot. So the first one is that very often the mindset for risk management in general and supply chain risk management is not present, especially not in top management. It's quite interesting that sometimes in the supply chain function, there is, of course, a mindset for risk management, supply chain risk management. But we talked to people who said, well, our company went well for the past, let's say, 10 years or 15 years. We weren't facing any real risks. So top management is would say, well, everything is going well. So why do we have to do some risk management? So that's often the case. And it's often not clear what are the benefits of supply chain risk management. Do we really have some benefits from it, or is it just a cost, additional cost? And of course, additional bureaucracy. In pharmaceutical companies and in chemical companies, very often they focus on risk already, but this risk is, in most cases, product related, and it's not focused. It's not identified in the whole supply chain. So, of course, if you talk about medicine, if you talk about pharmaceuticals, there is some risk of the product itself. But it's often not covered in the supply chain risk management.
Were you surprised by this kind of answers? COVID was just happening. Yeah. When you did the survey, were you thinking and were expecting more positive answers about supply chain risk management?
Yes, we were. Actually, companies were aware of it. So we talked about this topic with many managers, and they said, okay, we have now seen we should have had supply chain risk management in advance, so we would have been better prepared. So now it's the time to implement it. But
yeah, and David Cimcelevi from MIT in Boston already has a written book, Operations Rule. I think it's already 5 years old, 6, 7 years old, and in his book he explains the concept of time to recover and that kind of stuff when a link is taken out in the supply chain. So this has been around for a lot of years already.
Absolutely, I agree. And maybe you remember after Fukushima in 2011 and the flooding in Thailand in 2011, everybody had said, well, now this is the time that supply chain risk management gets a push because of this. It's a little bit surprising and also frustrating that not too many things have changed so far. Yeah. So we can see that if we look at the tiers in the supply chain, and you see this picture is from the SCORE model, where you have not only your own company but the suppliers and the suppliers of the suppliers, and the same is true for the customer point of view. The question was, how much?
Oh, sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Go. Do companies actually look at these different tiers in the supply chain? And what we can see is that the first tier suppliers, they're really identified, they're observed, they're watched by around 70% of the companies. So this is actually part of the supply chain risk management, the direct suppliers. But if you look to the left-hand side, the second tier suppliers or even lower supplier tiers, it's quite interesting that they are not really covered. So, and this was a learning from the Fukushima event, that the problems didn't occur or didn't appear in the first tier suppliers, but they appeared much earlier in the supply chain, on second tier level or third tier level. And the more it's interesting that those levels, those tiers, are not covered by risk management at the moment. And if you look at the right-hand side, you can also see also the customer levels are not really covered by the companies in a risk management system.
You know, in my opinion, even the 40.7% of those tier 2 suppliers, it's kind of high. When I ask companies, how do you know, or do you actually know who your tier 2 suppliers are? I think that the percentages are way lower. Maybe if you are into supply chain risk management, you have a better understanding who are your tier 2 and tier 3 and beyond suppliers. But I think that most of the companies don't even know who the all the tier 2 suppliers are.
That's perfectly true, Martin. And that's something, I mean, you mentioned the book written 5 years ago. And let's address the term visibility. Also, this term has been addressed, I don't know, 5 or 10 years already. So people or companies talk about visibility. We should have visibility in our supply chain. And as you said, very often the second tier suppliers are not visible to companies, to the OEMs. So that's, but on the other hand, if you want to be prepared for risk in the supply chain, especially for risks that occur on second or third tier levels or even earlier, you should have some idea who are your suppliers and what risks could occur. And I'm pretty sure when we hear Harold's presentation, we will have a perfect link to what I just say here and a solution to identify these risks. So let's talk about the maturity and professionality of supply chain risk management. We use a framework by RiskNet with 5 different levels. 1 is a very low maturity level, 5 is a high maturity level. And you can see it's, well, some kind of almost normal distribution with a mean of approximately 3. So they're somewhere in the middle. So it's not really, most of the companies are not real professional, but they're not worst case. That was, I mean, let me give you one example, which was quite funny. We had one answer or 2 answers from one company, and actually they were both in supply chain management, and these answers were actually the opposite. One said, well, our supply chain risk management is fantastic, and the other one said, it's, well, we just started our supply chain risk management, which was quite interesting to us that there were 2 different and opposite opinions.
And did you analyze what the reason was for this different kind of opinion? Is one, the higher executive expecting that all things are going quite well, whereas some are more in the middle layer, with his boots in the dirt, who are saying this is the reality? Was that the case, or?
Well, in this case, I knew one of them and not the other one. So we didn't ask both of them because we only had 10 expert interviews. But yeah. Exactly this was the point, that one was on a director level and the other one was on medium management level.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess so. But when you ask for what are the reasons, these numbers are just, if I tell you the average is 3, that's fine. I guess what's more important is if we look at the details, how is maturity measured? And we can see we have 4 different areas of supply chain risk, or of factors that support supply chain risk management. One is the risk management culture. One is the appropriate organization. A third one is the supply chain risk management process. And of course, it's also the methods. And here we see a slightly different picture than in the aggregated numbers, because you can see, if you look at the bottom area, that looking at the processes, most companies are quite mature. They have a process in place that is well defined. And also the use of methods for supply chain risk management is on a good level. That's quite clear because you have a toolbox with a lot of different methods and tools that you can use. So this is relatively easy to implement. Send people to a webinar or to a seminar, and they learn about these methods, and then they use them. What's much more difficult to implement is the top levels or the top areas. So if you talk about the culture, I talked about the mindset, the missing mindset. The culture is something that you do not implement by a click. You do not say, hey, from tomorrow on, we have a supply chain risk management culture. It's something that that evolves over time and takes some time. And also the organization. Martin, you asked me where to implement it, who is responsible. And you know that changes in the organizational structures are not done on a daily basis. So it's something that is normally on a strategic basis, changing the organization, especially when it comes to large companies. So it is quite obvious that these two factors are on a lower level, so culture and organization, in comparison to process and the method. But on the other hand, if you want to have an effective supply chain risk management, you cannot only focus on methods and process. You should have some culture and organization in place that support that idea.
So how do you address this challenge of culture and organization?
Well, it's something. Well, you have to start on top. Top management has to be convinced that supply chain risk management is something that helps a company. I mean, if you look at the term supply chain management, I looked up in Google some months ago if the requests for the term supply chain management and supply chains has changed after the pandemic. And this was actually true. So you can see, even in the, let's say, normal media, if you watch the news on television, that the term supply chain is much more used than it had been 2 years ago.
Oh, yes.
And you can, and also let's say the normal people, the non-supply chain management guys, they now talk about supply chains and the supply chain disruption because they went to a supermarket and saw there's no yeast, no toilet paper, no whatsoever. So I guess the importance of an effective supply chain are much more in place now than it had been before the start of the pandemic. So that's something that should definitely change the mindset and also the acceptance of the benefits of supply chain risk management.
And how does this topic relate to the pandemic?
Well, it was quite interesting that most of the companies, or there were some companies that had a clear plan. And you see that here. I hope you can see that on your monitors. There were approximately a quarter of the companies answered, yeah, we had some plan, either very specific for a pandemic or at least some general plan. So that was good. But if you look at the gray area, which is almost 2/3 of the companies said, okay, there was no a pandemic as a scenario, not the corona, but any pandemic has not been taken into account for supply chain risk management. And that is something where I say, well, coming back to the black swan, and we said, well, it's not a black swan. Information was available that the risk of a pandemic is existing, and the probability is not that low. I would say this is really difficult if companies are not prepared at all. I mean, they're very reactive now, and we talk with companies who do this firefighting, and of course they're effective in firefighting, but it's not efficient if you do firefighting. Yeah. But on the other hand, we talked to companies who are really well prepared, and this is an example. This is a logistics company, a medium-sized logistics company, who are in the pharmaceutical industry, and they do risk analysis for actually almost any risk that is existing or at least possible. Even they also have a identified risk of a volcano in Germany, which is highly unlikely, but if it happens, the effects are really crucial for these companies and for the supply chain. So they're definitely prepared.
You know, we did also two studies during the pandemic, one in March. And, you know, on a similar level, we asked, what kind of assessment have you done during the pandemic? So we asked 142 manufacturing companies in Europe. And most of the companies were doing assessments on an operational level. Where are my goods? Are they in transit, etc.? Then on a technical level, capacity planning, are they available or whatever? Is your supplier still producing, and etc., etc. But on the highest strategic level, only 1/3 of the companies, of the respondents, were doing assessment. Are my strategic suppliers financial viable? Are they existing in 1 or 2 or 3 months? Only 1 out of 3 companies did strategic assessments about their strategic suppliers and the strategic commercial channels. So on a strategic level, even during the pandemic, only 1/3 were on top of it on a strategic level.
I agree, and I mean, identifying the risks on an operational level is fine, but the effects of these operational risks are not that crucial. On the other hand, if you have strategic risks and they become true, they are realized, then the consequences might be so dramatic that your own company is affected dramatically.
So let's take a look at the effects.
Yeah, actually, it was quite interesting that beside the situation in the corona pandemic, the effects were only minor impacts so far. That was in, well, as I said, May and June. So most of the companies were not that dramatically affected by the corona pandemic at that time. Only a few, you see that at the bottom, where they have a very high impact or a high impact. So probably 15% were dramatically impacted or affected, and the rest was dealing relatively well with that.
Okay, but what we found out, there were a lot of demand peaks and demand drops, and there were supply chain bottlenecks. So we saw some visibility bottlenecks. So companies didn't know if they could expect some deliveries and that kind of stuff. So there were some bottlenecks, as we find out. If they were really affected is another thing, but there were a lot of bottlenecks.
Yeah, and you mentioned, Martijn, supply risks and demand risks. And remember, dear ladies and gentlemen, maybe the page where I talked about the different tiers of the supply chain and the relatively low level when it comes to the customer side. I mean, if you do not observe what happens on the customer side, you're not able to identify demand risks in a let's say appropriate way. And here the corona pandemic showed nicely that you have supply risk on one hand and you have demand risk on the other hand. So it's actually necessary to look to both sides, to the customer side and to the supplier side.
Some remark about Matthias Schenk. Do you want to recommend that?
Yeah, actually, it was quite interesting. So, of course, some of the measures were to have enough products on stock, and that helped a lot of companies. So I guess that was one of the reasons why the impacts were only of minor effect, like the 50%. Many companies we talked with said, well, we have dealt quite nicely so far because we had some products on stock, and that helped us to overcome this period, especially in the beginning.
Janet Gotzel, professor of Warwick University, did a study also in the same period in the UK, United Kingdom, and she found out that only 1/3 of the companies in the UK were depending more on their strategic suppliers. So 2/3 were depending on their own stocks, and some of the times they didn't have the right stock in place. So that was a costly activity, and 1/3 were smart enough to have a short connection with strategic suppliers to ask them, can you produce more or something else? So most of the companies were still depending on inventory.
Yeah, that's right. And that's quite interesting because it's actually in contradiction to what we sometimes learn about lean management, that companies try to reduce stock levels and reduce them. Here, they were actually helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what are your main conclusions of your whole survey?
Well, the main conclusions were, on one hand, it's SCRM is not implemented yet in a let's say appropriate way. So it's not really anchored in the companies, and that is true for both supply chain management and risk management. Of course, the large companies, they have supply chain management, but even if you look at medium-sized companies, supply chain management is a term that is not always used in an appropriate way, and it's not always implemented. And as it also means that the importance is not of risk management in general and supply chain risk management in particular is not that high. As I said before, the mindset is often not there. What are the benefits is unclear. Although there are enough empirical evidence that risk management helps companies, it's not there it's not available for top management. On the other hand, we can see that events like the Corona pandemic, they build up pressure on companies because they see, well, we have a supply chain which is not effective at the moment. We have to do something, or we should have done something. That means supply chain risk management will get a higher attendance by companies and top management. And of course, it's also that there are some external pressures from companies. So we see that the big OEMs often put some pressure onto their first-tier suppliers to have some risk management. And this is passed on to the second-tier suppliers, and so on and so on. So that's something we can see in contract logistics, but also in the big companies. And
yeah.
Yeah, to put it in a bottom line, I use a phrase from Klaus Kauer, who is really a very good interview partner, because he feels and he thinks risk management, and he puts it in a very nice and very simple way. Because actually, a risk management, an effective risk management, is nothing else than that you, on the good days, you think about the bad days. It's that simple. And if you do this, if you have a good day, well, be prepared for a bad day. So I guess this is a nice bottom line for this presentation. I hope so, at least, because it's very simple.
Yeah, and I have also sometimes doing presentations about trends, whatever. And if you have a strategy to climb a certain mountain, and everybody is aware to climb that mountain, so your strategy is clear, and everybody knows you're climbing that specific mountain. A trick what mountaineers are doing, before they are starting, and the same goes with special forces. They have a sit down and ask themselves what can go wrong, and do brainstorm all the things you can imagine that can go wrong. Mm-hmm. And even the special forces do that thing when they go on a military mission. What can go wrong? And you should even do it in a project. To think of it, all the things you can imagine that can go wrong. Should you have all the things available to make sure that if they are going wrong, that they should be in place? No, because otherwise you wouldn't climb this mountain. But mentally, you will be prepared for these kind of things when you recognize these things are going to happen. Mm-hmm. So that's also a approach of mountaineers. People with doing the parachute drops and special forces. They do these kind of things. So that's a good day, and think about a bad day.
Okay. Well.
Thanks for now. But we have also done several surveys, and then we get also to Harold about his startup. So what we did in June last year, so we had a first in March asking about what they are facing during the peak of the Corona crisis, and then in June we asked which areas you're going to invest in supply chain. Well, you see it right here. On top, it's sales and operations planning, still hot, and the second one is end-to-end supply chain visibility. That was the next one. Not surprisingly, because people, had bottlenecks and had lack of visibility on the demand side, on the supply side. But when you look at these different bars, the blue ones are the overall respondents of the survey, overall. And the orange one are the more mature companies with a level 4 or level 5 supply chain maturity on a 1 to 5 scale by Gartner. So what you see now, there's a big difference with the leading companies and the laggards. So supply chain risk management overall, only 8% of the respondents are planning to invest in the next 12 months, 8%. But when you look at the leading companies, it's 32%. So when you look at the orange bars, they have different intentions, different investments for the next year to invest in. And supply chain risk management, 1 out of 3 is planning to invest this kind of software. First, before we go to Harold, Michael, does it surprise you, this kind of figures?
No, not necessarily. One thing, as I said, after the Fukushima event, we thought, well, supply chain risk management would be implemented in companies. And I would say not so much has been happening so far. So I'm quite pessimistic, and yeah.
Okay. Some questions getting in, so people you can ask questions, and later on I will ask them, and you can even vote for questions. So I see questions coming in, and do start asking this, and you can also vote for this question. So what we did, and then we get to pre-wave and to this discussion and some questions. So we have done an analysis of almost 200 supply chain startups in Europe, and in all kinds of categories. From the left side, supplier management, to the right side, last mile. And one of them is pre-wave. You see it on the left, and you see a lot of course, you have on the last mile and in the freight matching area, you have all kind of startups and scale-ups. But also on the supplier side, we see more and more interesting, innovative new players popping up, looking at the supply side, I would say, or the inbound or upstream supply area. And one of them is pre-wave. And so Harold, welcome. So please explain, where are you coming from? So when have you been founded? And then we go into your pitch, what you are proposing as a solution.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Martin, for having me, and good afternoon to everyone here in this webinar. So my name is Harold Nitschinger. I'm co-founder of Prewave, and Prewave was founded in 2017 as a spin-off from the University of Technology Vienna, where the story of Prewave already started back in 2012, where as part of the PhD program led by my co-founder Lisa Smith, we developed artificial intelligence and machine learning technology to predict supply chain risks in the supply chains of manufacturing companies, both OEMs and suppliers alike.
Okay, so in what kind of area do you implement your solutions?
So our solution and our clients is implemented across the board in many different industries. What all of our clients have in common is that they have incredibly complex supply chains for one reason or another. We help them safeguard their supply chains from disruptions. And of course, a major candidate in this area is always the automotive industry, an industry with incredibly high product complexity, supply chain complexity, and demands on production. In the automotive industry, for instance, if a single component is delivered too late, then this can cause a standstill of the entire production line, costing up to $100,000 per minute. And yeah, the causes for such disruptions, they can really originate from all around the world and all across the supply chain.
So how big are supply chain disruptions on the global scale?
Yes, if you zoom out a little bit from the automotive industry to the entire global industry and economy, then supply chain disruptions amount to 380 billion euros per year. And this, of course, is a pre-COVID figure. So in 2020, we expect this number to be much higher. But more importantly, the causes for such disruptions, they can really originate from all across the supply chain. A labor strike at a transportation hub, an industrial accident at one of the suppliers, as we've seen right now, a supply shock in the semiconductor industry, mismatches between supply and demand, ramp up in commodity areas. So it can really originate all across the board. And what our customers and many companies are lacking is the information, the transparency about all of those potential risks that are affecting their supply chains on a day-to-day basis.
But there's so much to cover if you look at the world.
Absolutely, that's the thing. Supply chains are have never been more complex and intransparent, and also the data is out there. So this intransparency with the level of data, because we as human beings, we are producing more data than ever before in history. If you can go to the slide of the social media penetration rates, which are above 50%. Anywhere in the world. The data is public, the data is out there, and this is where Prewave comes in. And let me maybe show you what we actually do at Prewave, or what's at the core of what we do. As I said, currently at this point, more than 8 years of research and development, we have developed artificial intelligence models to analyze publicly available data in the local languages. So we analyze data points like social media posts, news media posts, blogs in 50 plus languages natively. And based on that, using our artificial intelligence models, we are then able to predict supply chain, but also sustainability risks in the supply chains of our customers. And these could be things like demonstrations at a copper mine, yeah, so very much on the raw material commodity end of the supply chain, labor strikes at seaports, transportation hubs, but then also really directly at the suppliers. We have cases where we were able to predict insolvencies of suppliers more than 2 months in advance, but obviously also focusing on things like natural disasters and more recently, and we have a case study on that, the impact of the COVID pandemic shutdowns and infections at suppliers.
Quite interesting. There's a question, I'll get to that later on from the audience, but this is mainly focusing on the supply side, on the upstream side, but is this also something you are doing on a demand side, where you say, okay, where's my demand, and maybe there are some things happening what I should know?
In specific areas, yes. Mainly our solution is focused on the supply side, but in the areas of specific commodities, we are actually also modeling not just the supply side, but also the demand side, and then are identifying, as is, for instance, the case right now, there's quite a severe crunch in commodities on the metal side right now, in steel, aluminum, and others, which is actually due to a mismatch currently of supply and demand. Specifically, OEMs and others demanding more swiftly than the supply side is able to produce and ramp up. Yeah, so that in those cases we are covering also the demand side.
Okay, could you give an example of how do you work with your solution?
Absolutely, I can show you an example. From the first wave of the COVID pandemic, actually the very beginning of the first wave. So Brembo is one of the largest brake manufacturers, and they are based in Bergamo in Lombardy province, northern Italy. Mm-hmm. And Brembo shut down their facilities on the 16th of March, so actually a week before the countrywide shutdown happened across Italy. But we were alerting our customers already a week before the shutdowns on the 9th of March, 2 weeks before the countrywide shutdown in Italy, and 1 week before the shutdown of Brembo specifically. We alerted our customers based on Italian language messages in social media and news media channels that we are able to analyze and pick up on announcements and warnings that a shutdown at Brembo is bound to happen. And this is really the let's say the early warning prediction side of what we do for our clients. But then if we follow the story along, we actually also alert on the reopening of Brembo. And this is done either on, again, publicly available data, but also what we have done, and many of our clients have done during the pandemic, they have brought their suppliers on board onto the Previv platform, and now we are actively getting updates from the suppliers. Yeah, so suppliers are actively updating their status, saying we are able to produce again, we are active, our production is not affected, or obviously our production is currently still limited. So covering both the publicly available data, but also the direct feedback from the supplier, and putting that together is really a main a core ingredient for increasing supply chain resilience.
Quite interesting what you're saying right now. I had some calls with supply chain executives in March last year. They were totally busy, and one was a manufacturing company producing fragrances and flavors for food manufacturing. Yep. And this supply chain director, he received a lot of calls from customers, mainly well-known manufacturing companies, multinationals, and they were asking, "Are you still producing? Are you still open?" Yep. And I was surprised that they didn't even have a WhatsApp group to say, "Yes, we are still open, and you can order your stuff." So they get a lot of calls. So you have a solution to have this matched and to make sure that they are all in sync about if you are still producing or opening up.
Absolutely. This was the main challenge during the COVID pandemic, was actually a process challenge. Is how can can an OEM, but also a supplier, actively communicate their current status in an efficient way across the supply chain. And as a tool to aid that process, we actually launched our coronavirus supply chain disruption map, which actually shows publicly, thanks for skipping ahead there, that actually shows publicly more than 40,000 suppliers across various industries and their current production status. And of course, this production status is either based on publicly available data, where we understand they are currently on short-term work or on shutdown, but it's also based on those updates of the suppliers themselves. So really bringing both sides together. And at this point in time, this disruption map is used at many of our clients on the C-level, on the board level, to have a real-time view into the condition of their supply chain on a day-to-day real-time basis. Which of my suppliers are producing, which ones are at risk, which ones are currently shut down.
You know, if I see this fascinating map, and I've seen it before, but you know, if I would be a manufacturing company, I would like to have you know, a personalized or a company-specific map. Okay, this is what's happening right here, but where are my strategic suppliers, and how do these dots relate to these strategic suppliers, my factories, and my demand points?
Absolutely. And this is what you get if you become a Prewave customer. Yeah?
Okay.
So
okay, cool.
If you head over to covid19.prewave.com, you get the public version, and we made this public for a reason. And one reason is to incentivize the suppliers to update their status and keep their operational status up to date. But of course, our customers, automotive OEMs, electronics OEMs, and suppliers, they have their own version of the map, seeing just a picture into their supply chain, and seeing this tailored to their supply chain.
So I skipped this one. So what kind of risk are you covering?
Yeah, so obviously now taking a bit of a step beyond just COVID risks, we are really covering the full spectrum of what we call external risk factors on the supply chain. And this could be things like labor unrest, political unrest, so demonstrations, worker protests, but also very critically at this point in time, financial stress and legal stress. So specifically on financial stress, many of our customers and most of companies in this area, they are already using financial risk data, credit reports, Dun & Bradstreet, and all such data. But at this point in time, you really need an early warning indicator on the financial health of your suppliers. And this is what we are providing with Prewave, being able to deliver predictive risk signals on the financial health of the suppliers. And then going to the bottom half here, the bottom half of risks, those are risks that are detectable for us in real time, not predictable. Things like industrial fires, explosions, accidents, natural disasters. Those are data points where we actually also integrate external sources from the USGS and other disaster feeds, and also cyber risks that we are covering for our clients.
All right. You know, we get this one, but now port strikes, and you know, what are the new things happening then and now?
Yes, absolutely. So if you guys, if you're interested, you can head over to prewave.com and have a look at some of the case studies. We regularly publish case studies on the risks we are able to detect and predict. Recently, for instance, we were able to predict the shutdown of the Shanghai airport a few days in advance, because we picked up on Chinese language reports of infections of a FedEx cargo worker at the Shanghai airport, which then down the line, a few days later, led to the shutdown of the airport. Another such case study is a supplier insolvency of a Chinese supplier that we were able to predict 2 months in advance based on Chinese language social media posts of workers complaining about unpaid wages, that they haven't received their wages, and other data points. So I welcome you to head over to prewave.com and have a look at some of those case studies.
And my final question to you at this moment is, what is a prediction at this moment? Do you have some predictions right now? What you see happening? What will happen in the next few days?
Yeah, well, the next few days is, of course, a very, very short timeline. But I think if we talk about the next quarter and the next few months, we very much foresee, and we're already seeing the let's say early indicators for that, is that after the COVID infection wave, the insolvency wave will start occurring. And I think this is no surprise to anyone listening here, that due to being able to defer tax payments and others, very many suppliers are currently on life support. And once you take that life support away, they will have a lot of troubles financially. Yeah. So we are currently actually in the process of further improving our models in the area of financial stress, and are also developing a insolvency monitoring dashboard, which is specifically geared towards delivering early warning signals about pending insolvency risks in supply chains.
Probably from specific companies, so that you can recognize these are strategic suppliers on my side.
Precisely.
Okay.
Precisely.
All right, we get into the end of the webinar, and feel free to ask questions now or maybe later if you are joining us in the lounge. So we have created the model. We have even this transversed in an end-to-end supply chain visibility assessment. But I was wondering, here I have created an overview of the supply chain. On the left-hand side, you see your tier 1, 2, 3, and so on upstream. And in the middle, you have your internal focus. And on the right side, you have your demand channels, well, also tiered. And on the left side, you see supply chain risk and compliance. I was wondering, we don't go into deep this slide, but Michael, I see only discussions mainly on supply risk and compliance on the left-hand side. Do you also see that in your environment, and is it also according to your survey?
Yeah, that's right. And if one of the questions in the chat where I just looked briefly is focusing on ESG risks, so environmental, social, and governance risks. So that is something that is connected to your results here as well.
And then another question is, maybe if we start the Q&A here, one of the questions is, could you give some advice according, what you should do? What does supply chain resilience mean? And what kind of supply chain resilience strategies for small and family business companies are, of use? Could you ask something about supply chain resilience? How do you create that? Michael?
Well, yeah, that is a question that has been, that I'm discussing with many companies around Fulda, because Fulda, my university is in a small town, 65,000 population of 65,000. So it's many companies of small and medium-sized companies and family-run businesses, and they have the same question. Actually, my answer is normally very simple, and it's not scientific at all. I would say just start on a low level, but do start. Start by creating some visibility. So start to know who is in your supply chain, to both sides. Upstream focus, downstream focus. And then, as Martijn said, ask yourself, okay, what can happen? And of course, if these risks occur, what's the consequence of these risks? And then what can be done in advance to overcome these risks or to prepare for these risks? And that's very simple. I know this is a very simple approach, but many companies have not done this first step.
No. Yeah, we are almost at the end of this hour. So if you have more questions, please join us in the lounge. If we end this webinar, you will see a yellow button on the top of your screen, and you go into the lounge, and you can sit down at tables. You can even sit down with us, but even with other people who are joining us in this webinar. So there are 74 people here. Wrapping up, we will publish a supply chain risk board game. This is the Dutch version. Will be published next week. and the English version will be published a month after that. It will become available online, so you can play this game with dice, and you can from the raw material to your customer, you can play this game and what kind of risk you will encounter during your journey in supply chain. So we will make this available. Not next week, but after that, we will have another webinar about end-to-end supply chain visibility. We will do that with the consultancy firm PwC. You might know them. And with this, I would like to thank Michael and Harold for joining us. Michael, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Harold, thank you for joining me with your great pitch and your great, innovative solution.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you.
And to all the listeners, thank you for joining. And with this, I would like to wrap up. And hopefully, I will see you not next week, but the week after that. So next week we'll have a week off. But then we will join again, and we'll have a great webinar, as I said, about end-to-end supply chain visibility related to this topic. And with this, I would like to say see you next time, or I will see you in a few seconds when we go to the lounge. So thank you all, and hopefully I see you next time, or I will see you right away here in the lounge. And thank you for joining us.